I, Neelima Dalmia Adhar, Ehsaas Woman of Delhi-NCR, am delighted to welcome all of you to an exclusive session of Tete-a-Tea initiated by the Prabha Khaitan Foundation. It's a privilege to have with us today Darrin Farrant on this edition of our much-awaited Tete-a-Tea. Before we begin, please allow me to introduce the Prabha Khaitan Foundation. The Prabha Khaitan Foundation is a non-profit organization based in Kolkata, dedicated to promoting literature, performing arts, education, gender equality, and women's empowerment. With a deep-rooted commitment to cultural enrichment, the Foundation curates a diverse range of initiatives that bring together voices from across the artistic and literary spectrum. From engaging author meets and prestigious book launches to thought-provoking panel discussions and literary festivals that welcome both emerging and established writers, the Foundation fosters a thriving literary landscape. Beyond literature, it celebrates artistic expression through boutique festivals and captivating performances by singers, dancers, and theatre. The Foundation continues to preserve cultural heritage and spark meaningful conversations and create spaces where creativity and expression flourish, such as the one we are holding today. And now a bit about our special guest, Darrin Farrant. Please come to the dais, Darrin. Mr. Darrin Farrant is a communications expert with 32 years of experience, including 2 decades with the United Nations. From 2012 to 2022, he has served as Special Assistant to the Under-Secretary General for Global Communications and later as the Acting Chief of Office in the same department. His UN roles also include speech writing for the Secretary General, editorial work with the UN News Center, and leading communications for the Secretary General's panel on South Sudan referenda. Darrin Farrant specializes in crisis communications, campaign development, and strategic planning. Before joining the UN, Mr. Farrant was a journalist and editor for The Age, Melbourne, and The Times, London. He holds a bachelor's degree in law and arts from the University of Melbourne. And today's conversationalist is our own beautiful darling of the PKF, Shinjini Kulkarni. Shinjini, please come forward. She's the founder of Sai Shinjini Academy of Fine Arts and Culture and a very precious Ehsaas Woman of Noida. She's a dancer, a Kathak dancer by excellence, runs her own institute, and she is the iconic Birju Maharaj's granddaughter. Can we have another round of applause for her, please? And now no more buck from me. Over to you, Shinjini and Darrin.
Thank you, Neelima ji. Thank you for such a beautiful introduction. And thank you, Darrin ji, for being present here today and allowing me this opportunity to be in conversation with you on the special year that UN is celebrating its 80th year since inception. Firstly, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
Before we get into a conversation about everything that UN stands for and is doing and what more we can expect from it, I would like you to introduce to us what is UNIC and what is its objective. For some of us who may not be so well aware, all of us have heard about the UN, but maybe not so much about UNIC. What is it?
Sure, I think most people actually haven't heard of the UNIC, or as we call it, UNIC. We have so many acronyms at the UN. UNIC, there are almost 60 of us around the world. They're information centres, communication centres, with the goal of raising awareness of what the UN is doing in those countries where we're present and building support for our key causes. So in this case, I head up the one here in New Delhi, and we service India and Bhutan. So we use a variety of techniques and platforms. We use social media, we use websites, newsletters, outreach activities, public events, all sorts of activities to try and raise awareness of what the UN is doing in all the different ways, the whole UN family, and to build support for things like climate action or the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the fight against poverty, etc., and also peace and security, human rights, all those causes.
Absolutely, thank you. When the UN was formed 8 years ago, the world was a very different place. Different countries dominated the global scene, and the requirement, I think, in my own ignorant way, would have been mostly about peacekeeping and not allowing another world war to happen. 80 years later, 2025, we have conflicts happening at various stages, whether the Middle East or China, Taiwan, so many, I don't want to name. How do you assess the UN's impact in globally in keeping peace in terms of security or even in terms of development? What do you think you can assess as the impact that it has been able to create in 80 years?
Sure, I think, that's obviously a question best answered by historians. But from inside the UN, I think we can stand on a pretty good record over those 80 years. Yes, it's easy to think of all the failures or missed opportunities, or right now the conflicts and crises that you've mentioned, but let's also think about the ones that were averted, were prevented, that don't get so much attention. Let's not forget, it's no small thing that there hasn't been a World War III. Now, yes, there have been huge conflicts around the world, but, we don't want a World War III. We have to remember that, we live in an imperfect world. The UN is an organisation made up of its member states, so we don't have always the full reign, the full ability to do what we want. We're constrained by what our member states do. They don't always agree, and you see that now in certain conflicts in certain regions. So I think sometimes people are a little harsh on our ability on the peace and security front. On human rights and another pillar of the organisation, we've worked very hard over the 8 decades to really build up awareness and understanding of the universality of human rights. It's not just some Western construct, but it's something for all of us. And, through the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights and through all the important documents, most importantly, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that, an Indian national was instrumental in its drafting. Through those, we've kind of led the way. Again, it's not perfect, but I think we've come a long way, remember, since how the world was in 1945. Humanitarian aid, I think that's somewhere where we've been very strong in responding to natural and unnatural disasters and to crises around the world. We're doing it right now in Myanmar just this week after the earthquake. And then on development, well, in the case of development, it's a glass half full or glass half empty situation. There's still far too many people in poverty, far too many girls lacking the same opportunities as boys, far too many people not having access to adequate healthcare or education, far too many people living in unhealthy cities or homes, far too many people without access to running water, but yet there's still so many more than there were before. There's he's since passed away, but a Swedish academic, Hans Rosling, wrote a book called Factfulness, I think, in which he talks about that and talks about the enormous improvements that the human race has taken over the centuries, but particularly in the last half century to 80 years, and the enormous statistical gains that we've made, and we shouldn't lose sight of them. So in summary, I think we've done a lot better than our critics would say, but of course we need to do an enormous amount more.
Absolutely, I agree with you on that, with UN, the world is a better place. At least there is some platform for global cooperation and initiatives such as this. Darrin, there's an increasing concern towards a refugee crisis that the world is facing. While we are able to avoid international conflicts or a world war, the reality remains that the localized conflicts also creates a refugee crisis across. And apart from that, the countries who are able to take the refugees in, they see that over the years, slowly, there's an alienation that happens within. The assimilation isn't able to happen. What is the UN doing for rehabilitation, and what are the impacts, what are the initiatives that one could list down in terms of solving this issue, which is cropping up in all aspects, in all parts of the world?
So we're seeing record numbers of refugees around the world, the highest numbers since really the UN was founded. It's really disturbing to see around the world as a result of so many conflicts, but also as a result of droughts, of natural disasters, of economic inequality, people being forced to move and leave their homes. And I think it's only going to get worse. You know, just the climate impacts alone. I mean, I come from Australia. If you look at the islands of the South Pacific and the rising sea levels there, we can expect more people to have to move as a result of that. So refugee numbers long term are not going to suddenly drop, even if we are able to end some of those conflicts. So I think as we approach the problem, we have to think about a couple of things. One is about tackling it and ensuring that the people who are moving are getting the support they need, but also being realistic about it. You know, so many politicians and so-called leaders find it easy to divide us and to attack refugees as a problem and a drain on societies, instead of bringing us together and looking at the facts, which is that they make an overall positive contribution. And, you know, I think we need to think, and that's what we're trying to do. The odds aren't easy, and we don't have as many resources as maybe some of our opponents, but we're trying to build that case through communications and advocacy to understand that actually refugees, supporting and helping refugees is a good thing and needs to continue.
Absolutely. You mentioned climate crisis. Reminds me of the fact that 2030 is when we have set the goals for the SDPs, the Sustainability Development Programs. Where are we in terms of reaching those goals? Are we on line, on track, on route? Do you feel like we will be able to achieve the goals that were set out for 2030 at the UN Forum? And what are the challenges that one is facing in this process?
Sadly, we're not on track. We are way, way off track. It's disturbing. We've only got 5 years to go. And the most recent sort of comprehensive report on the SDGs said that we're only on track for 17% of the goals. And by the goals, sorry, I mean the targets. They're the 169 targets that fall under the 17 goals that you've heard of. So we're way, way behind, and we don't have much time to get there. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't lose heart. In fact, it means we just have to double down, in fact. There's no other option. What is it, giving up? It's not an option. So, you know, we need to think about, we were hit very badly by COVID. You know, countries that were really putting in and contributing to lifting their populations out of poverty and improving and building better lives in communities face an enormous economic and social setback. So it's understandable that we're struggling, but that doesn't mean we should give up. We have to double down as much as possible, and also to see beyond 2030. Yes, it's a very important deadline, but the world doesn't change on the 1st of January 2031. We're going to face the same problems. We knew that when we collectively designed the SDGs. It wasn't like the end of the world happens and then everything's solved, but it gives us a target to aim for and to all build around, and we need to keep doing that going forward. And let's not forget, even though we're way off track, as I said earlier, you know, in the last 30 years or so, we've lifted enormous amounts of people out of poverty. You know, if we think of India alone, but also other countries, you know, have made enormous improvements from, you know, only a generation ago. So we shouldn't lose hope.
I agree with you on that, but there is something that I wish to clarify and question, really. Please understand that I'm a completely ignorant person when it comes to the functioning of the UN, and I'm asking from a layperson's perspective. I was reading a few articles in the previous week, and it spoke about how many countries which are a part of the UN are not contributing to the budget of the UN the way that they are supposed to. And there are many more defaulters over the years, and the pattern is only increasing. US is the main funding country, and even they have had an issue with many of the accords that were there, and also trying to pull out of some, especially with President Trump being in presence. We really don't know which way this is going to go. Do you think that these goals can be met 5 years or 5 years hence, given the fact that so many countries are not able to contribute monetarily to the UN? And how do we keep up with it without the fundings coming in?
Well, we don't keep up if we don't put the funding in. So the answer is to make a case to keep building support so that people do see the need, to think long term rather than maybe for short term domestic political reasons in some countries, to think long term and to see what a fantastic investment it is to really get behind the SDGs and what you do to your economy and your society when you do that. So that's what we have to do. Yes, some countries are not paying their dues. It's very unfortunate. We keep asking them to do so. When we don't have those dues, it makes it hard for us to do our work. It means we can't have the full complement of staff or the programs that we would like, but we keep making the case, we keep identifying the needs and asking, the member states to step up. I mean, I think it's important to remember the UN isn't me, it's all of us. You are the UN as well. You are the UN through your countries and just by being a human being. The first words of the UN Charter are "We the Peoples." So don't think of it as some distant ivory tower in New York. Yes, on the news you see the Security Council or the Secretary General holding forth there. The UN is everywhere in the world, and it depends on all of us to make it better. All of us up and down the list of issues that we deal with and the list of mechanisms that we work with. Maybe we can't make change right now in a certain conflict or a certain issue, but in another one we can. Even the Security Council, the much derided Security Council, which as we know is deadlocked on certain conflicts, is actually making progress on a whole range of other conflicts that we don't hear about, that don't make the news. And they're getting agreements for peacekeeping and peace building in all sorts of other areas where, the permanent members of the Security Council agree. Yes, they're not on those other conflicts, but they are doing things. So, we have to keep going where we're making progress, we have to keep doing it. And where we're not, we all have to step up and do our part to try and make the case, to pressure our leaders to get those kinds of changes, to put in that funding, to do the right thing so we can build a better future for us all.
Absolutely. I have a few questions coming out of that answer, but
Yes.
firstly, there is one way in which the UN and India are very similar. Both are bureaucratically very heavy, and they have a lot of they take a lot of time in decision-making processes. We have that issue with our country, with our government, and we're trying to create a single window situation for most businesses to work out of. What is the UN doing? They've faced a lot of criticism. How do you think you can make the organization more agile, more responsive, because it is known to be slow to act?
Yes, so the Secretary General has just launched an initiative for UN80, a reform process. He set up a task force with one of his key lieutenants to oversee it, to look at ways to find efficiencies and improvements, to check that all the mandates that we're working on are appropriate, and to see if there are any ways or needs to realign or make changes at the UN. So I think that process is going to be really important in making the kinds of changes that we all want to see. I know myself from being at the UN for a long time. Yes, it's bureaucratic. Part of that is because we have 193 members. So getting them all to agree on something can be really challenging. That's normal, that's understandable. And making sure that we have systems that take into account everyone's different needs and perspectives. But we could certainly be a lot more efficient too. And so that's what I think this process, this initiative will bring about.
Sure. The other thing that you mentioned in your previous answer was also about how each one of us is the UN, really, through our country. And it sounds like a very beautiful thing that, I as an individual could make a huge change in the world, bring peace or bring comfort to a person who is in a crisis. But please tell us, to our audience, how can that happen in a tangible way for someone who's sitting in New Delhi and is not associated with the UN, does not understand the nitty-gritties of how this organization works, but would like to do something for the world, for the climate, for the refugees, without having that kind of political might?
Sure. I mean, I think what people mightn't realise is that every day Indians, for example, since we're here, are doing things big and small to try and improve the UN and improve the world. You know about it, of course, through the government, the permanent mission of India at the UN, but also through your NGOs, through your private sector companies, through your activists, through your youth leaders, climate advocates. All of those are involved in various projects, starting maybe in your local community, something you're passionate about. You can take it to scale. You can use it to advocate with your local MP, with your government to bring about changes. Most of the big changes in the world that we've experienced in the last, half a century, especially on climate, but also on gender, they started out of civil society. They didn't start with some government saying, I've got the bright idea to make some progress. They started with people like you, people like us, who said, the current situation is not acceptable. The state of our rivers or waters are not good enough. Our air and gender equality is too far away, etc. All of these things started with the public making the case themselves, and they started small, right, with one person. Even look at someone like Greta Thunberg as an example of, the power of one person to make a difference. And also to think about how it connects. She has spoken at the UN. So, from that tiny start, a school student having a protest once a week, to being, affecting global change and being such a powerful advocate, that can be replicated in so many different ways with so many other issues. As I say, you start at your local community and then you build up from there.
Just to simplify this a little bit, in the Global South, we have this system of communities doing work for others. Mm-hmm. For example, how would an organization such as Prabha Khaitan Foundation, which has national presence and now international partners as well, be able to bring its initiative to the platform of the UN?
All year round, the UN is holding numerous forums and activities, conferences, events to kind of unearth the interesting projects and initiatives that are taking place. Last year I went to a school in Bengaluru where these students were utterly incredible. They were 13 or 14 years old and they were designing apps that could help you identify cancer at an early age. And they were doing the most incredible things, and certainly something that was far beyond my abilities at school. And the great thing was, not only were they doing them, but they were coming to the UN. The reason I met them is they were going to New York for a big event where they could showcase what they were doing, and they could get in touch and network with others to take those projects and ideas and bring them to scale and try them, pilot them in other countries. India is a huge proponent of, South-South cooperation, which is one of those ugly jargon words, but it's in fact really important. It's countries of the Global South getting together at country level, but also person to person, group to group, and sharing ideas and best practices about how to make things better. So, as I say, all year round, the UN is having, student events, it's having NGO events, it's having conferences around glaciers or autism or mine action. That's just this week, So the whole gamut, whatever issue you can think of, the UN is bound to be working on it, and there are bound to be Indians also working on it and having initiatives that are being showcased or discussed, through the UN.
Absolutely. You briefly mentioned about the much derided Security Council. India is the most populated nation. It is a growing economy. It has an extremely strong military. It is a nuclear power and has been clamoring for a seat at the permanent members of Security Council for a long, long time now. There are reforms that are talked about ever so often or about Security Council, especially regarding the veto power and the representation. What is your perspective on this issue? And do you see India getting a seat at the table anytime soon?
I share the views of the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who has been very vocal and very clear that India deserves a seat at the Security Council. You're 1 in 6 of the human race. It makes no sense not to be. And as he points out, unfortunately, the makeup, the composition and the structure of the council reflects the world as it was in 1945, not today. So from the UN itself, from the Secretariat, there's enormous support to open it up. And not just India, Africa, for example, should have a larger say. All that needs to be there, unfortunately, as there's always the but, is that it requires the member states, the current members, the permanent members of the Security Council, to agree to the new, a new structure. So until they all agree, there's no change at all, basically. So we're stuck at the moment. There is paralysis, but there's always, before the breakthrough, it seems impossible, and then at some point a breakthrough is made. So, India keeps making the case, the very clear case, and the very overwhelming case of its need to be in the, and its right to be almost in the council. It has to keep doing that. What's the alternative? To give up? To seek an alternative mechanism? Because unfortunately there is no other one. So, this is the game that's played. It's through the Security Council. India needs to keep trying. I can't predict if and when it'll happen, but it doesn't mean India should lose hope. It needs to just keep, keep pressuring and making the case for why it should be there and building up, if it can, and as much as it can, the kind of coalition of support for that case.
Absolutely. I quite understand your answer. But keeping this in the background, there is also this current trend of declining multilateralism. Most countries, especially during COVID, we saw this the most, and then further it has only continued. Nationalism is on the rise everywhere. There is every president is trying to pursue some kind of isolationist policy. With declining multilateralism, do you really feel that the UN will remain the platform that is the only game to play? And it would be the platform where absence will mean that you do not have a way of putting your voice forward?
Yes, I do. I think, we hear sometimes alternate proposals, but they're always a small select group of countries. They're never, the great thing about the UN is it's universal. Everyone's a member, everyone gets a seat at the table, and it brings a legitimacy to its decisions and its processes. So that's why, there are regional forums that are very valuable, but they're valuable at the regional level. If you want a global solution to a problem, the UN is the only way forward. I was thinking about your point about declining multilateralism. That's very much the case. And for UN80, that's the case we're trying to work against. We're trying to show, the theme of UN80 is building our futures together, shaping our futures together. And we're trying to show that in our communications, the value, we thrive together. That's the only way. Yes, at the moment the winds don't look so great for us, but I would actually say just look at this week and the news and the reaction to that news. I think in some ways there can be a counterswing as people see that when one country goes it alone or takes a unilateral approach, other countries see, well, maybe we should get together. Maybe multilateralism is the way to go, and that these isolationist approaches don't work. So, right now things mightn't look so great, but, there's always a counter.
But do you feel that platforms such as ASEAN, BRICS, BIMSTEC, or the likes could be an alternative to the UN at any point?
Not an alternative, a supplement. And they work well, many of them. And the UN works with them. We have very close relations with a lot of regional organisations, with the African Union, for example, particularly in the area of peacekeeping. And we know that it's often more effective in peace and security when you have a regional organisation very closely involved. The solution is much more accepted by the local population, and the same with something like BIMSTEC. So yes, they definitely have a need. They'll always have a need, but you'll also have global problems. Think of the biggest challenges in the world today. They are transnational, they are global. So how do you solve them if you don't have a global organisation or mechanism to deal with them? Otherwise you have a patchwork of answers.
I see. Darrin, you've spent over 3 decades now in this organization in multiple capacities.
So 2 decades. I was a journalist for 10 years before the
My
UN.
apologies, 2 decades, 2 decades. But a long time enough to see so much of the political history been written right in front of you in the rooms where you've had a seat. Do you remember any interesting anecdote from the time where one such decision was being taken or such a negotiation was happening and you were present?
Gee, that's an interesting question. I think one thing that always sticks with me is my time in South Sudan. Just before South Sudan became independent, the UN supervised a process where we oversaw the referendum that led to it becoming independent. And so I was there as head of communications for that mechanism. And it was incredibly inspiring to see people who had not had the opportunity to express their democratic rights really in their lives. In fact, yes, in their lives they had not done that. And they were finally getting the opportunity. On the first day of voting, we went to various voting stations, around South Sudan, Sudan and what became South Sudan, to oversee and check that voting was taking place appropriately. And when I say voting stations, this would be a hut in the middle of nowhere we'd go. And the hut would have one rudimentary table. It was all very basic. And then we would get there, so we make sure that everything was all right. And we'd get there very early in the morning to make sure. And we'd be there, at 7 a.m. But in fact, 300-400 people would have beaten us to it. They were so keen to vote, to have that opportunity to express their voice. And there they were, zigzag style, in the long grass, patiently waiting for 8 a.m. when voting began so that they could cast their vote. People who were on one leg, literally, because unfortunately landmines were a huge issue in that area, hopping in the queue as they, were beaming with excitement to be able to cast their vote. So to be a part of that, to help them on that way, the UN was the midwife. We weren't the lead. They themselves took that opportunity, but to be there was incredibly inspiring.
How wonderful. I think we should have a round of applause for that specific anecdote. It goes on to show how you are touching the lives of people and how big an impact you're making in their lives. Kudos. I have a rather odd question, and
Okay.
I've only thought of it since my school time. I was a political science student, and I always wondered how difficult is it, given the fact that you have headquarters in one country, a certain country is also funding you for the majority, and there is greater representation. How difficult is it for the organization such as UN to maintain that there is no bias in decision-making processes, especially towards developing nations which were not part of the Industrial Revolution, and now certain kind of climate decisions, goals are being pushed so that the world can be saved while they had no part in it?
I don't think you can ever remove bias if you have human beings. There's always going to be bias. So, our job is to keep fighting at that bias and to bring as many people to the table and ensure we are as diverse but as representative as possible. India is a very key player in the UN. Remember, it became one of the founding members of the UN. Even before its own independence, India was a part of the UN. You had key people involved in the General Assembly, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Your peacekeeping record is second to none. And so I think, I'd love to see more Indians take pride in what your record is at the UN, and to think about in the future speaking up more and advocating more for India at the UN, and thinking about how you can use your own leverage to get a more effective and better functioning UN, and one that represents all. Absolutely. It sort of answers you, I think, indirectly, maybe.
It does.
Not quite the answer.
I hope we are here to celebrate UN at 100 together and have another conversation on that also. But there's still 20 years to go. There's another 20 years worth of fight on different issues that one has to fight, and the UN has to fight together. Where do you see the UN take the world and take itself as an organization over the next 2 decades, and remain effective and relevant as a global institution?
I think the UN has to get less hierarchical, more horizontal, and so that people everywhere in the world feel they have a stake, not just in the big countries or the big cities, that people everywhere feel connected. I think the UN has to get more digital as well. It's not easy to say for someone. I come from a pre-digital era, but I think the UN has to do that more. And I think the UN has to take more consideration about the needs of younger generations. And in fact, the UN, although those things I just mentioned, the UN is trying to do. When the UN turned 75, we had a process that has led to where we are now with the UN 80 and what we're working on. But we started with this process called Our Common Agenda, where we looked long-term. What are the big issues for the next 50, 100, 200 years? How can we make sure the UN is fit for purpose for them? And so there was a big process involving member states to think about those things, to think about something like AI that's going to be enormous. It already is enormous. How do we regulate that, and in a way that makes it benefit for all? And how do we regulate it or support it in a way that doesn't increase the digital divide between the North and the South? So that's another area where I think the UN is going to have to get more active and involved in the future.
Absolutely. I hope that we are able to sit together and discuss where it has been going and where it has reached finally when UN is at 100. I think we're almost out of time. One last question from my end. Very simple and very straightforward. And I hope that you're able to also sum it up together in one sentence. Why do you think US is needed now more than ever, given the UN, given the geopolitical background and the realities of the world that we're living in?
I think there's no other serious alternative. As I've been saying this evening, the UN is not perfect. It can be reformed. It needs to get better. But just because we haven't solved all of the world's problems doesn't mean you throw it out. The UN is the one global organisation, the one universal organisation where everyone in the world can get together to try and thrash out solutions to our biggest challenges. And there's no other way.
And before I close, in your personal capacity, do you think there is going to be a change in the world order in the coming next 2 decades?
Definitely. There's been a change in the last 2 decades. The world keeps evolving. We all thought we knew what history was in 1991, and look where we are now. It's a very different picture. So it would be foolish not to think that the world is going to keep changing. I mean, technology is changing all the time. the way we relate to each other changes, so I'm sure there's going to be changes in the world order as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I open the floor for questions. If anyone has questions for Darrin, we can have a mic. Ji.
Sir, about 150 Indians have been awarded the Victoria Cross. Only 21 have got the Paramveer Chakra. And 20 of them were fighting for the armed forces of India. There is one exception, and that is Captain Gurbachan Salaria, who died in the Congo in 1961. Does anyone remember him? One. And let's keep in mind the fact that there are 2 wars going on right now. And what kind of role can the UN play?
Well, at the UN, we definitely remember him. We remember him because we remember India's contribution historically and now to peacekeeping. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's second to none. The volume of troops and police that you provide, but also the expertise, the intelligence that India contributes and keeps contributing. For example, just 2 months ago, I attended a conference hosted by India about women in the global south and peacekeeping. A very specific subset of peacekeeping, but about how women can be more involved as peacekeepers and as peace builders in their countries. And it brought together women soldiers, but also civilians from many different countries around the world, all from the global south, though. Very, very diverse group with lots of ideas on how they can improve things. So that's an example of how India is always contributing. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but we know at the UN what India has done, particularly in the Congo. You know, even today, where there's a lot of trouble right now in the east of the country, Indian troops are active there in trying to keep the peace in very difficult circumstances. One of the issues we face with peacekeeping is that member states don't always give us the sufficient funds and mandates to do our job. The notion of peacekeeping is a post-World War II idea, and it's, as the name suggests, keeping the peace. There has to be an existing peace to keep for our blue helmets to go in, and the 2 sides have to agree they're not meant to be active combatants in a war. So right now, people point at Ukraine or Gaza and say, why isn't the UN got peacekeepers there? Well, for clear reasons, the 2 sides there in those conflicts won't support that idea, and there's still active hostilities going on. But in the case, in many cases around the world, the Congo, but also Sudan, South Sudan, Central African Republic, many others, peacekeepers are active and working effectively, and in many cases led or critically involving Indians. So we won't forget, and we continue to depend on the expertise, but also the materiel and the troops that India provides.
Ji, Rachna ji.
Thank you, Darrin, for being here and talking to us about 80 years of the UN. I had a simple question for you. Since we are reflecting on 80 years of the UN, what would you think has been one moment in history that the UN would be very proud of, and perhaps one where you felt that the UN could have done much better?
Well, I think one area is decolonization. The UN has been instrumental in helping so many countries be born. Now, that happens less and less today. Obviously, that was a feature more of the 50s and 60s and maybe a little bit in the 70s, but that was no small achievement. Unfortunately, it doesn't get the recognition it deserves. I don't just mean the UN's role, but decolonization. And what it... Well, I think there's no need. We'd be talking for 10 minutes. I mean, you know, when the UN started, it was, 51 members? And we're now 193. So, you know, most of those have come through decolonisation. We had something called the Trusteeship Council, which still exists but is largely in abeyance now, because most of its work has been done in bringing, people into decolonisation, into independence. And I think, the UN was very important in those days in making that happen. And so I think that's something we can be very proud of. In terms of where we could do better, I think, and I think about things where we haven't been so successful. Unfortunately, I think about something, the anniversary is just next week, and that's the Rwanda genocide. So next week we have, I think it's the 31st anniversary, and the UN will have, big ceremony in New York for that, but also some events here in Delhi to mark that, and working with the Rwandan embassy here. But I think that's where, unfortunately, our peacekeepers weren't able to do what was necessary. And we see the horrific result of that. So that's something I think is something we all regret very much.
Neelima, please.
Yeah, you want to take the question? Should I? Okay. Good evening. Yeah, I'm Sanjay Jain. As far as I recollect, there are 6 principal organs of the UN system.
That's right.
And roughly about 17 specialized agencies which are there.
Well, I mean, we have specialised agencies, we have funds, we
Funds
have
and programs, and
and we have
so roughly 17
more.
as far as I know.
There's 26 alone
Okay.
operating in
So-
India. So in fact, there are more than that.
More than that.
My
So, no, you were talking about the funding structure.
Yes.
Now, I want to understand 2 things. How is the power flow relationship between these 6 central principal organs and the so-called 26 projects or specialized agencies? And what kind of a shareholding pattern is there? And how is the flow of funds is from the 6 principal organs to these, or they have an independent structure and the fund flow is independent and the shareholding of the different countries is independent? How does it?
It'll be tough to give you a short answer to that. It'll be a very long answer. Each of those agencies is different. Some are part of what's called, and I'm part of that myself, the Secretariat, the kind of core of the United Nations that has a core funding system. The Secretary General is a part of that. For example, one of the 6 principal organs, the Secretariat. Some of the agencies have they all have their own structures and system, and in some cases they report to the Secretary General, in some cases they don't, they report to a board. In some cases their funding is assessed by what's called assessed funding, which means countries have to pay in. Others it's voluntary contributions by countries. So it's very hard to give a short explanation. It really depends on the individual agencies and their relationship.
So which means that these 26 specialized agencies, their funding structure is independent of the 6 principal organs, and they get the funds separately and directly it goes to their kitty.
In large part, yes.
Large parts. So don't you think there is a power struggle going on in the world? Who controls which agency? Who's controlling UNIDO? Who's controlling WFP? Who's controlling UNFPA? Who's controlling WHO? And some are withdrawing, some are adding. Isn't there some kind of a power struggle going on to increase the shareholding in these organizations?
Well, I mean, historically, countries that contribute a lot to individual agencies certainly want to see their voice reflected in that agency. We've seen that historically. That will always be the case. I mean, that's the same in a regional organisation or in any other intergovernmental body. The more you put in, the more you expect to be able to get something back in return. That's commonplace. I think for me, the issue is that, countries are not always consistent in the way they approach these agencies. They try and pick and choose. I like these agencies, or these agencies fulfill certain mandates that are important to me, so I'll support them. But others that I don't like, I'll try and, have my own sort of selection, and then they won't support politically or financially certain UN agencies. And I think that's really misguided. So right now we're in this position. Some countries are not giving their full funds, but again, they're picking and choosing which agencies they're cutting back on or not supporting. And I would like to see a consistent approach so that all the agencies can carry out their work. Because after all, the agencies didn't create themselves. Countries created every UN agency. They identified a need. You know, for example, UNAIDS, which was created in the 90s, I think, late 90s maybe, came about because the world identified there was a need to have a standalone entity to deal with this enormous crisis. So, it needs to be funded and supported in a way so it can do the job that the countries say it needs to do. And that's just one example. Yeah. I mean, it's the same that applies to any of them. UNICEF, World Health Organization, anything.
So to that extent, isn't there a pressure created by the funding countries that they decide, they are the principal deciders, or they put pressure that these are the programs which are to be done and these are the regions which are to be covered to a large extent?
Well, as I say, I think any funders of any entity always think that they have a right to have a larger say maybe than others who don't pay as much. That's always going to happen. But, the UN also strives to be independent and to maintain its neutrality and to stick to the mandates it was given, which is not, these entities don't have mandates that just apply to one country, right? They're global organizations. So we try at the UN to service all those global needs rather than just servicing one or two countries.
All right.
Thank you. I'll just do the last two questions, if that allows. Sure. One for Neelima ji and one over here.
I'm going to ask you something which is very relevant and very topical today, is the threat of artificial intelligence. So with AI churning out everything from fake news to Bollywood scripts, how does the UN in India plan to harness this technology to amplify its voice, without accidentally outsourcing peace talks to a chat box?
That is a great question. I mean, you called AI a threat. I think it's both a threat and an opportunity. And that's the way the UN sees it, and that's probably the way every school student sees it as well, right? And maybe school teacher as well, using ChatGPT. But no, in all seriousness, I think, the UN recognises that this is going to be, and I was saying to you earlier, going to be a key issue going forward, right? So we need to regulate it to make sure that it's not being abused as much as possible. Now that's, the utopian goal. We're going to strive as much as possible to regulate it in a way that's light enough, that's not over-regulation, overburdening, but at the same time tries to avoid the worst excesses and the worst, effects and impacts. And at the same time, ensures that there's not a digital divide. You don't have to come from a wealthy country or wealthy community or wealthy school or, a connected place in order to take advantage of AI, that everyone has an opportunity. And also that where it works well, where it's effective, that those initiatives and projects and ideas get expanded so we can all take advantage of it. If AI can lead to breakthroughs in healthcare, why should it only be available to people in the West or rich countries? Why shouldn't everyone get a taste of that? So this is what the UN is looking at, and in fact, a very senior UN official from India, Amandeep Singh Gill, is the Secretary General's envoy on technology, and he's been leading in this process. We have something called the Global Digital Compact, which all the countries have agreed to. It's just a sort of a framework at the moment, but we're looking further on at ideas to how maybe make it more concrete in the way that we shape the way AI is governed.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anubhav.
Namaste, Darrin. I'm Anubhav. I have two small questions for you.
When people say small questions, they're never small.
They're very small. Okay, so in a world where one resource saved often means that one resource is overexploited, how does the UN ensure true sustainability rather than shifting the burden elsewhere? For example, fossil fuels, greenhouses, gases to go down, and now e-waste is generating. more and more, we are coming up with EV vehicles and batteries, and the waste is just continuous, and it will keep growing. The second question is, what do you see at the United Nations most urgent priority in the next 5 years?
That is a really hard question. I mean, the thing about the UN is we're always juggling 47 balls at once, right? We're working on climate action. We're working on poverty. We're working on clean water. We're working on getting aid to the victims of the Myanmar earthquake this week. We're working on trying to get food into Gaza. We're working on trying to bring about de-escalation of a conflict in the Central African Republic. We're working on promoting human rights, on saving endangered languages in my own country, in Australia, for example, or in the Amazon. So it's very hard to prioritize those and say, you should do one before the other. And I think sometimes, I'm not saying you are, but I think critics of the UN and critics of action often try and make that point that you somehow have to only do one thing to get that right before you can move on to the other. And I think that can then lead to inaction because we see some other very pressing need and think, well, I can't make the case. India just this past year added something, the Moidams of Assam, to the World Heritage List, a fantastic recognition of India's great cultural and historical legacy. It was really important, a really, valuable moment for India and for the world because it becomes part of the world's heritage, right, by being on that list. Or do you say we shouldn't do that because there's war going on elsewhere or there's climate change? No, we have to continue, we have to progress on multiple fronts at the same time. So I'm kind of avoiding answering your question by saying there's not just one thing. We have to keep working all the time in different ways. And then your first question was about resources. Well, that's the challenge we face, right? And that's the case the UN keeps making. We are definitely at the vanguard of saying get rid of fossil fuels and to make sure that e-waste is dealt with sustainably. I don't claim, and the UN doesn't claim to have simple answers to these problems, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't stop striving to get there. So, the UN is a member state organisation. We're calling always on the member states and their companies and their NGOs and their governments and ministries and states and local councils to take the actions that are needed. So we're there to advocate and to push and to coordinate and to unearth and showcase the good things, etc., to hopefully come to those goals.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been such an insightful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Shinjini.
Thank you for this opportunity, and I hope we will discuss 2 decades later UN at 100.
See you in 2045.
And thank you, Darrin and Shinjini, for this absolutely amazing, captivating session. I would like to express my sincerest gratitude to our guest, Darrin Farrant, and Shinjini Kulkarni for steering us through this enriching dialogue. I'd like to also thank our distinguished associates, BLS International Services Limited and Sai Shinjini Academy of Fine Arts and Culture. I thank our hospitality partner, the Connaught, and last but not least, the audience for being so engaging and interactive. And your time and presence has made this evening truly. As you all know, that the Foundation promotes cross-cultural understanding and appreciation to foster unity and appreciation of the rich cultural heritage across the Indian diverse states. And we are pleased to felicitate our guest today with the Ponnadai shawl, which is a ceremonial garment often made of silk or cotton with gold or zari borders that embodies elegance and charm. It's usually worn during formal occasions, festivals, and weddings, and is considered a symbol of great respect and prestige. Can I request Alison Barrett, Country Director of British Council of India, to please felicitate Mr. Farrant.